petition of the Supreme Court. It talks about, the article talks about it a little bit. And so one might naturally ask, my goodness, why are some senior advocates making so much money? I mean, enormous sums of money. Much more than I think just about any lawyer in the United States even is making. And so how can this be? Well, so one answer might be, well, my goodness, maybe they're just really good and they have an effect. They have a causal effect on the outcomes of cases, right? You're paying the money because without them, you might lose, but with them, you have a much better chance of winning. That's presumably why they get paid a lot of money. But what's interesting is, this is a question that gets asked in the United States all the time as well. Lawyers get paid lots of money, but do they actually make a difference? Do they actually take a case that's not as strong and make it a strong case? Or are they just kind of parasites? They're just skimming money off of the system, but the cases would kind of come out the same way anyway. Now, I'm a lawyer. I practice law. I certainly have a vested interest in the answer coming out a certain way, so perhaps I'm biased. But I really do believe that lawyers do matter and they do have a big effect. But the interesting thing is, it turns out it's actually very hard to show empirically that lawyers have a big effect. People have been trying to do this for years in the United States, and it's been a real struggle. So let's take a look at this this study. So what it does is it looks at admissions hearings for SLPs. These are special leave petitions that are within the discretion of the Supreme Court to admit. And so during this hearing, the advocate for the petitioner will try to argue the case, why the case should be admitted to the Supreme Court. And the court gets tens of thousands of these per year. So they, as part of their research, they took a sample of cases. They looked at who the advocate was and whether the case got admitted or not, and what kind of case it was. And what they found was, in this particular sample that they chose, the average odds of success in the sample was 44%. But the success rate was different depending on whether you had an advocate or a senior advocate. The success rate for advocates was 34%, and the success rate for senior advocates was 60%. So a huge increase in the percentage win rate, right? In the percentage win rate. Now you'll notice the concluding sentence on the first page. It says, the data seems to confirm what is commonly believed, that engaging a senior advocate seems to increase the likelihood of notice recognition. So you'll notice the very cautious language that the folks who did this research employed. They didn't say it does cause, they said it seems to cause. And so the question I guess I have for you is, why were they so cautious? They had a very carefully constructed sample. They made a clean comparison, of percentage win rates, and they found a big difference in the percentage win rate. But they're still very cautious. They say seems. So clearly they're worried that correlation does not necessarily imply causation. Right? They're worried, and they should be. We all should be worried, right? They're being very careful researchers. They don't want to overstate their claim. So good for them. I applaud them for that. But I guess the exercise for us today is, well, why are they so cautious? What were they worried about? Any thoughts? What were they worried about?
Lawsuits.
Lawsuits. You're just worried somebody might get mad at them, I guess. Yeah. All right, that's a good lawyerly answer. Okay, but in terms of causal inference, what might they be worried about?
Because if you look at the graph below, it seems to depend. The success rate of non-senior advocates it goes up pretty exponentially in the kind of matter that the SLP is about. Land acquisition and requisition and indirect tax matters. The difference between senior advocates and non-senior advocate success rates is not that different. So that's why I guess you can't say for sure.
Yeah, so
even in this third category data, especially in land acquisition related matters, non-senior advocates have better exposure than the senior advocates. What this?
Okay, yeah, so some interesting issues. So both of these comments relate to the second page, these graphs here. And so there's a couple important observations being raised here. This is kind of why we're going to spend tomorrow talking about statistics, even though it's not maybe the most fun part, is because we'll be able to get a better understanding of why things like small sample size might be a problem. You'll notice these circles are kind of helpfully indicating how big the sample size was. You'll notice it's a bigger sample for service matters and not so big for land acquisition and tax matters. So we'll talk more tomorrow about why sample size is important. And we'll also talk about this issue. Well, if we take a look at service matters, it's 77 to 33%. That's huge difference, okay? But then if you look at indirect tax matters, it's 70% to 63%. That's an advantage, but a small advantage in terms of percentage rates for senior advocates. And what we're going to talk about tomorrow is we might think to ourselves that difference between 70 and 63% is not what we'll call statistically significant. So when we have a relatively small sample size and a relatively small difference between two values, it may be that as a matter of statistics, we cannot reject the hypothesis that difference is just due to random chance, rather than a true causal effect, or even a true predictive effect, right? Even a correlation that isn't really about causation, it's something else, but at least not random chance, right? So for example, there's a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, a wonderful professor, world's leading expert on bankruptcy law. His name is Douglas Baird, if any of you are bankruptcy law people. And he loves to tell this story about credit card companies who are trying to figure out who to offer credit cards to. So they wanted to figure out who would be more likely to pay back the credit card and who would be more likely to default, right, to default. And so this credit card company engaged a company that collects information on what people buy. All these detailed records from, when you go to the store and they punch in what you buy into the computer, right? It all gets reported somewhere, and then these people sell that data to the credit card company, and they analyze the data. And so what this company did is that they didn't care about causal effects, right? Again, they just care about prediction. They don't care why people pay their credit cards back. They just want to know who pays their credit cards back, what predicts who pays credit cards back. So they looked at all of this data on all of the different things people could buy, how much they bought, what kinds of products they bought, and they found what turned out to be the best predictor of paying back your credit cards. It turns out that people who buy these little felt pads that you stick to the bottom of your tables and chairs so they don't scrape the floor. So people who buy these little sticky felt pads to put on the bottom of their furniture, they always pay back their credit cards. Now, is it that buying felt pads will cause you to pay back your credit cards? Of course not, right? If I force you to buy felt pads, you're either going to pay back your credit cards or not. But it's not because I forced you to pay back to buy felt pads. But it was a good predictor, right? It was a good predictor. And I think we can kind of imagine why, right? The people who take the time to say, oh, I want to protect the value of my furniture and my floor, I'm going to buy these little felt pens. Those are the kind of people like, boy, I really want to protect my credit rating. I'm going to make sure to pay back my credit card every month right on time. Right? And so even though there's no causal relationship, there is a true predictive relationship there, right? So that's a good example of a prediction, but not causation, right? But sometimes it's just random chance. And so when you have a small sample size and a small difference between two things, we can't conclude that because 70% is higher than 63%, that means that as a statistical matter, that for indirect tax matters, senior advocates have a higher win rate than regular advocates. It could just be a matter of luck that this sample of 18 just happened, just by chance, to have more wins by senior advocates than regular advocates. So that's something we'll talk about tomorrow, is how do we determine statistically whether this is likely to happen by chance or not. That's what we'll talk about, statistical significance. Okay, so that's one issue. But then you say, well, wait, what about land acquisition matters? Regular advocates have a higher win rate than senior advocates. Does that mean that actually for land acquisition matters, it's the other way around? And this goes to the point that was made a moment ago, which is, well, they didn't, this conclusion, senior advocates increase the likelihood of notice being given, might hold for some but not all categories, right? So that's one of the reasons they speak cautiously, is maybe it really depends on what category you're looking at. And some of the categories have really small sample sizes, so they're not so sure, right? They're not so sure. So they don't want to overstate their claim. So that's true. And now again, 44 versus 56, does that mean that senior advocates don't have a higher win rate if we look at a bigger sample? Or does that just mean we have a really small sample and just by luck there's that difference? Oh, we don't know. We'd have to actually do a statistical test to see if it's statistically significant or not, right? But these other two differences are so big. I can tell you, just because I've done this enough, I don't have to actually run this test. I will tell you, these differences will show up as statistically significant if you were to run a statistical test, these first two columns. Okay, so what if we just looked at those first two columns and said, look, there's a big difference here. Can we at least say that senior advocates cause more success for service matters and ordinary civil matters? Or might there be other things that come from this? Might there be other possible factors that mean it's not necessarily a causal relationship? Any thoughts about that? The issue here is an issue that's plagued all sorts of studies of the effects of lawyers, and it's a selection effects issue. It's a selection effects issue, which is, how do we know that the cases that senior advocates represent and the cases that regular advocates represent are the same, except for the fact one has a senior advocate and one doesn't? Or is it that certain types of cases that maybe have a better developed factual record, cases that have that are more likely to win anyway, right? Maybe they're just more likely to win anyway. There's no guarantee that the cases that senior advocates take are basically the same as the cases regular advocates take. It could be that there are all sorts of different. It could be that senior advocates are really good at telling which cases are going to win anyway, and so they pick those. Or it could be that the kinds of clients who can afford to pay a senior advocate a lot of money are also the kinds of clients who can afford to do a good job building a record in the high court and in the lower courts. That makes it easier for a lawyer to do a good job in the Supreme Court. Right? So it could be that there's a problem of selection effects, or you could call it omitted variables or misspecification or whatever. There's the concern that what's really driving these differences is that the cases that senior advocates represent are just different from other cases. And that's why you see this difference. It's not because the senior advocate is actually making the difference. It's that there's just a difference between these two types of cases. And so this is why, although there have been hundreds of studies attempting to measure the effect of lawyers on case outcomes, if you ask an economist, do we know empirically whether lawyers help their clients win cases? I think the honest answer is empirically, we don't know. Because it's very hard to find an example of data where there's not this underlying selection problem. Why? Because clients get to choose their cases and lawyers get to choose, clients get to choose their lawyers and lawyers get to choose their clients. The only way to truly guarantee that it's a comparable set of cases is if you take all the cases that got appealed to the Supreme Court and then you just randomly mix them up and say to a group of senior advocates and regular advocates, okay, we're not going to tell you which are which. Okay? We're just going to give half of them to the senior advocates and half of them to the regular. Can you hear me okay without this? Should I take it off? Is that okay? Or them, give half to the senior advocates, half to the regular advocates, and without letting them know which cases are which, and then see if there's a difference in outcomes. That would actually tell us something, right? That would be an experiment. We're going to talk a lot about experiments, obviously, but that's basically why experiments are generally a good idea. The problem is, can you convince a client to say, look, you were going to hire the most famous senior advocate in India, but you know what we want you to do is flip a coin, and we'll decide which advocate you get based on the coin. I think the client would say, no thanks. I actually, I'm happy to spend my money the way I see fit, not the way some law professor wants to play games with my with my future. So that's why this generally hasn't been done. There's been in all of the history of empirical research on the effect of lawyers, there's been exactly one randomized experiment, and that was done because it was a legal aid bureau where the people who were affected weren't getting lawyers anyway, and so the only question was, we've got 1,000 people who want lawyers, we only have 10 lawyers, so we're just going to randomly give some people lawyers and see what happens. And in that setting, at least in terms of internal validity, in that setting, there was an effect. It wasn't huge, but there was an effect, so that's something. But that's it. There's been one randomized study. So this is the challenge that observational. We talked a lot about observational data versus other data. I mean, this is the real challenge that we face with observational data. Is it's very hard to run experiments on like real people in real life situations. But if we're not running an experiment, how do we know that the correlation we see is causal? Now, I happen to believe that it does seem to confirm. That's true. I actually think it does support the view that there really is an effect. But the data as presented is just correlational, right? And they haven't found a way to rule out the possibility that it's really just that clients who can afford senior advocates can also have stronger cases and stronger. Right? They haven't been able to rule that out, and that's why they're so cautious in the way they describe their findings. I think very appropriately. So that's the idea. So that's the issue we're going to see again and again in observational data. Is how do you account? Are these two groups that you're comparing, are they really the same, except for this one thing that we're looking at, or are they different in many ways? That's basically what we're trying to get at. Okay, so I just want to talk about that. I thought it was a really neat article that I read recently, and I think is a good research agenda to know about. And that continues. It's ongoing. So anyway, any questions about the material so far? Does anybody have their own research they want to talk about?
Yes, sir. I have one question. Why are we not concerned about the subjectivity of the researcher?
Okay.
Because it is a very, it may be a bit clear in deciding the data of the research, because the type of question that researcher asks, questionnaire of the researcher, can be an important thing that we haven't touched upon.
So, okay, great question. So, there may be a concern about the subjectivity of the researcher affecting the empirical results, right? And this can happen in many, many ways. So let's talk about some of the ways it can happen. So, so the first way that it can happen, the order doesn't really matter, but the first way that I'll mention, the first way that it can happen is in the data collection itself. So you might think to yourself, I'm going to do a survey. I'm going to go out to people, I'm going to ask them a series of questions, and I'm going to collect their answers, and then analyze the data. Now, depending on how the question is asked, can affect how the answers are given. So you can ask a question in a very leading way. The order in which you ask the questions can affect how people answer them. And in fact, there's a very large body of research by psychologists showing the different ways in which you can affect the answers people give by changing the order in which you ask questions and so on. So if that's the kind of research you're doing, where you're actually asking people questions, sort of survey type research, then there are best practices. There are methods that one can and should use to reduce the impact of those factors. So, for example, the order in which questions are asked will be randomly given. So some people get one question first, other people get a different question first. The way the question is asked can be reviewed ahead of time by others, and so they can give you feedback. Oh, this question is leading. This question is confusing. You know, you can get that kind of feedback to prevent that kind of bias from creeping in. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Or sir, can we increase the sample space? Can we increase the number of researcher and the sample space likewise? Because in way one person asks question will be a different. The other person asks the question.
Yeah. So one issue may be, even if the questions themselves are fine, we all think they're fair. If you actually send out interviewers, what if different interviewers ask questions differently? So the way that you deal with that is, yeah, ideally if you have more interviewers, it won't just, the results won't depend on one person's specific style. And then what you also want to do ideally is to make sure that the interviewer assignment is such that the same interviewers, for example, let's say you have 10 interviewers and you have two groups, treatment group and control group. You want all the interviews to interview both groups, so it's not just that one interviewer interviews the people with kids and one interviewer interviews people without kids, and then you see a difference. Well, is it because they had kids or because they had a different interviewer, right? So you want to make sure that the way the interviewers are assigned, right, is not correlated with the things you're actually trying to measure. Now, how do you do that if you don't know who has kids to start with, right? Well, then again, we come back to, this is something you'll hear a lot. Ideally, random assignment, right? If you randomly allocate researchers across people, that will make it more likely that they get a mix of people of different types. But there are some types of research where that concern is smaller. So, for example, if you're not doing interviews, right, but you're using observational data, or it's pre-existing data, the data may have biases in it, but they're not your biases. Right, which means that there's less danger that the researcher has manipulated the data to reach a result the researcher wants to get. Right? And so one of the good things about observational data is the creation of the data is independent of the researcher, and therefore there's less, and even if it's not intentional, it could be subconscious, right? It could be unintentional bias, right? Either way, there's less bias. However, even if the data creation itself is not affected by the bias of the researcher, there's lots of other ways the bias of the researcher can come in. And I think I'll try to find, I'll have to figure out whether I'm going to do it. Maybe I'll do it on Friday, but we can talk more about this. But there are lots of ways. Some intentional, some could be completely innocent, unintentional, in which the researchers can skew the results. So you run a regression and it's highly statistically significant. So it looks like a really strong correlation. But it turns out, what if you ran the regression with one set of controls, with some variables, and it wasn't significant? So you tried again with a different set, and it still wasn't significant. So you kept trying, and then you found one that was significant. And you don't report all the other ones. You only tell people about the one regression that did have a significant result. Right? It looks really impressive, but in fact, it's just it's the product of a very selective process that creates a very skewed impression of what the data are telling us. Right? So that's a kind of irresponsible use, right, of statistics in that situation, because it creates a misleading impression for the reader. Right? So that's an example of subjectivity negatively affecting. And there's lots of ways. Some subtle, some can only be done if you're trying to do it. Some can be done